opening the door to a queen's pawn game structure. This flank pawn push instantly contests central squares and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Developing the knight so early allows for swift central influence and prepares for fianchetto or other rapid piece deployment. Developing the kingside bishop to its optimal diagonal is the idea, aiming for king safety and a flexible pawn structure. Solidifying the d5 square and preparing for queenside expansion, this pawn push subtly anchors black's position. Developing the bishop to g2 aims to pressure black's central pawn structure and prepare for kingside castling, creating a flexible fianchetto setup. Boldly challenging the center immediately, this advance creates a dynamic pawn clash and opens diagonals for the bishops. Securing the fianchettoed bishop's influence, white prepares to challenge central space with a gradual build-up. Unleashing the bishop fianchetto, black immediately challenges white's queenside pawn structure with active development. Developing the bishop to **bb2** fortifies the queenside and prepares for a potential pawn push on the queenside, controlling the long diagonal. Solidifying the d5 pawn and preparing kingside castling, this move creates a firm central presence and opens pathways for the queen and remaining bishop. Developing the knight to f3 solidifies the kingside and prepares for castling, while subtly contesting the center and keeping options open for further pawn advances. Nurturing the development of your knight towards e5 or f6 solidifies your central presence, preparing for a potential pawn break with e5 or c5 and offering more flexibility than its prior square, which could have been targeted by a later d4. Securing the monarch initiates a proactive stance, preparing to connect the rooks and leverage the open central files. Challenging the central pawns directly, the bishop relocates to an active diagonal, aiming to liberate the queen and potentially pressure white's queenside. This repositioning prepares for future pawn breaks and creates a dynamic setup, although it does briefly expose the king to potential discovery attacks down the newly opened diagonals. Solidifying central control and preparing to develop the queen's knight, this move subtly repositions white's pawn structure to counter black's queenside ambitions. Prophylactically securing the kingside against potential bishop incursions is a sound, albeit passive, defensive maneuver, though it does concede central initiative and can hinder piece mobility. Solidifying the kingside and preparing for future central expansion, this knight finds a comfortable haven before potentially heading to f3 or even a more active square on the queenside. Bringing the queen to the center begins to unlock the queen's attacking potential and also eyes the kingside castling structure, hinting at future queenside expansion or potential king's pawn storms. Opening the center with this pawn exchange, white seeks to challenge black's pawn chain and potentially open lines for their pieces, aiming for active play in the ensuing middle game. Reclaiming the center with the pawn is a natural response, unlocking the bishop on c8 and preparing for a more active queenside game. It also opens the e-file, which could become a battleground. Unleashing a pawn thrust to seize the center, white immediately challenges black's pawn chain and aims to open lines for their pieces, creating dynamic imbalances and demanding a swift, precise response from black. Slamming open the center, black forces an immediate reckoning of tactical possibilities, embracing the ensuing pawn structure with a bold exchange. Opening the central diagonal for the bishop and challenging the knight's central influence creates immediate dynamic possibilities. Bishops now eye each other, a tense standoff on the h2-b8 diagonal, forcing a decision on piece placement and potentially clarifying central pawn structures, as the knight on g1 is no longer shielded. The central pawn lunges forward, aggressively challenging black's knight and seizing more kingdom territory. This dynamic advance injects immediate tension into the position, forcing black to react to the encroaching white pawn. Observe how this creates a pawn chain that aims to restrict black's pieces, particularly their kingside development. Consider the potential for white to follow up with knight maneuvers, perhaps to f4 or d4, further solidifying this newfound space advantage. The king's safety, while not immediately threatened, becomes an increasingly important factor as the center opens. It's a sharp, ambitious declaration that demands black's full attention. Boldly snatching the central pawn, black immediately challenges white's ambitious e5 pawn and introduces tactical fireworks, aiming to disrupt white's comfortable setup and potentially gain material or initiative. Recapturing on e5 immediately offers a clear path to resolving central pawn tension and simplifies the position, potentially allowing white to seize the initiative by activating the bishop and preparing for further development while black's knight on e5 now appears somewhat exposed. Recapturing the bishop on e5 offers a welcome simplification, immediately easing the cramped position black has been enduring and opening lines for their own pieces to become active. The rook awakens and immediately pressures the pinned knight, forcing black to confront the central pawn tension or risk material. Reclaiming central space and preparing for counterplay, the knight finds a more active post, eyeing potential weaknesses on the queen side. The queen ventures out, immediately seeking to exploit the now open c-file and perhaps pressure black's queenside structure, while simultaneously preparing to reinforce the e4 pawn should black's knight decide to retreat. Snatching that rook feels like a quick gain, but consider the positional price. Your king's safety suddenly looks a lot less secure with the weakened kingside pawn structure, and white's pieces are poised to swarm the center. The ensuing open files, particularly the e-file, will become a tactical battlefield where white's well-placed pieces can exert significant pressure. Reclaiming the rook with check, white initiates a decisive sequence, forcing black's king into a precarious central position and effectively dismantling any coherent defensive setup. Relinquishing your king's safety for material is a dangerous gamble. The ensuing king hunt will test every defensive resource. King's safety is now the paramount concern, as the monarch is rudely exposed to the enemy queen's glare, forcing a perilous reevaluation of black's defensive structure. The bishop's retreat to e6 defensively secures the knight and aims to consolidate material after the earlier rook sacrifice, but it leaves the king still exposed to a potentially crushing queen attack along the now open diagonal. A daring gambit emerges as white leverages the exposed black king to initiate a swift attack, forcing black into a defensive posture. Suddenly, black is scrambling to consolidate their material advantage after a daring queen sacrifice by white. This pawn push aims to break white's immediate attacking rhythm and create some breathing room for the misplaced bishop on a1. But it also opens up the a8-h1 diagonal, potentially inviting further activity from white's queen on b4. Snatching that rook on a7 immediately severs black's queenside development and creates a significant material advantage, but it risks overextending the white queen into a potentially dangerous neighborhood where black's minor pieces, though currently somewhat uncoordinated, could quickly converge. The long-term ramifications of this capture depend heavily on white's ability to consolidate and shield their queen while simultaneously exploiting the newly won material against black's exposed king. Reclaiming the material deficit necessitates developing a swift counterattack against white's exposed monarch. That rook on the open b-file, now an aggressive spearhead, aims to disrupt white's queenside cohesion and potentially create threats along that vulnerable edge of the board. Initiating a decisive counterattack, the queen boldly ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's precarious pawn structure and potentially exploit the exposed king. Rethinking the attack on the rook, black chooses to solidify the center and prepare for a potential kingside defense. This redirects focus from the material imbalance to the urgent need for king safety and piece coordination. The immediate aftermath of this decision will likely involve white consolidating their material advantage, so black must prioritize developing a robust defensive structure and looking for counterplay opportunities arising from white's potentially overextended queen. The knight's journey to d8, while seemingly passive, aims to reinforce the d-pawn and offer an escape square for the king, anticipating future king hunts. Boldly repositioning the knight, white aims to disrupt black's now exposed monarch by potentially targeting the weak squares around it and asserting pressure on the queenside, leveraging the open queenside files. Sacrificing the bishop for a rook and a pawn asterisk seems asterisk appealing, but opens a dangerous diagonal towards the vulnerable black king, and the queenside pawns are now critically exposed. Regaining the minor piece by forcing the exchange now clarifies the material balance, and importantly, white secures the open queen's file for the monarch's safety. Relocating the king to f8 solidifies its position against immediate discovered threats, seeking a more secure harbor in this complex middle game that has evolved from a queen's Indian setup. Unleashing a powerful queen sortie, white seeks to exploit black's scattered pieces and create immediate threats against the exposed black king. Re-establishing the bishop on f6 aims to fortify the kingside and prepare for potential counterplay, though the current position offers little immediate opportunity to disrupt white's queenside advantage. Reclaiming the knight from its defensive post on the queenside allows for a more central deployment, potentially reinforcing the e-file or preparing a maneuver to the kingside. This repositioning signals a shift in white's tactical geometry, aiming to activate underdeveloped pieces and create new attacking avenues against black's slightly exposed king. Consider how this knight's new location might influence the dynamic on the d-file or support a future advance on the kingside, where black's pawn structure is already somewhat compromised. Observe the subtle interplay of forces. White is not rushing but rather building pressure, and this knight's journey is a crucial step in that deliberate construction. A proactive central presence is established, aiming to restrict white's queenside mobility and potentially leverage the d-file's open nature for future pawn advances or piece activity. Capturing that pawn now initiates a dangerous chase, turning the queen into a roving predator across black's territory. Reactivating the knight towards the center, this piece aims to disrupt white's queenside domination and potentially prepare a counterthrust. Reasserting centralized influence, this knight jumps into the fray aiming to disrupt black's slightly passive coordination and potentially exploit the open c-file should it ever truly materialize, while simultaneously providing a defensive screen for white's own king. Re-establishing a central presence, black aims to reactivate their rook along the c-file, preparing to contest its occupation and challenge white's increasingly dominant queen. Repositioning the bishop to b7 initiates a subtle but critical campaign to reclaim lost material and apply pressure to black's vulnerable queen's rook. Reclaiming the initiative on the open file, this maneuver begins a strategic tug-of-war for control of the c-file, aiming to disrupt white's queen's dominance and create counterplay. The queen now aggressively reclaims central influence, threatening to infiltrate black's weakened queenside and potentially create devastating forks. Shifting the knight to e8, the black player initiates a subtle repositioning, aiming to untangle their pieces and potentially prepare for a central pawn push or a renewed attack on the queenside. This knight's journey highlights the importance of piece mobility, especially when faced with opposing pressure and a disrupted pawn structure. The knight's relocation to c6 initiates a fascinating positional squeeze, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure and restrict the active dark-squared bishop. Repositioning the rook to the c-file offers a subtle defensive reorganization, preparing to contest the open file and shield the bishop on c8, aiming to consolidate the position against white's queenside pressure. Liberating the bishop from its gilded cage creates an immediate attack on the e8 square, potentially isolating the black king and disrupting any semblance of defensive coordination. Reclaiming the rook on the e-file now initiates a crucial defensive sequence, as the immediate threat of the bishop capturing on e8 is neutralized, though it doesn't resolve the overall material deficit and the exposed king position that remains a significant concern in this unfolding endgame scenario. This maneuver injects a knight into a remarkable central outpost, its presence now dictating terms on squares previously controlled by the opponent. White leverages the bishop pair's dominance, aiming to capitalize on the exposed black king and the weakened structure around it. A desperate attempt to stir chaos, this rook sacrifice aims to disrupt white's consolidated advantage and potentially create counterplay on the weakened king's side, though the material deficit makes it a long shot. Placing the king on g2 prepares for potential checks along the first rank and clears the escape square if the knight on d6 has to move again. A daring foray into the enemy's camp, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and perhaps find a weakness in the king's defense. The recapture on e8 not only tidies up the central pawn structure, but also opens a decisive assault on the enemy king's exposed position, leveraging the discovered attack on the rook and creating an unstoppable mating net. The monarch, now exposed, must navigate a minefield of potential threats, prioritizing immediate survival above all else. Pushing the pawn now aims to solidify white's queenside presence, potentially preparing to advance it further and create a passed pawn, while also limiting black's king's newfound freedom to maneuver. Initiating a crucial king march to centralize and defend, a pragmatic response to the lingering pressure on the queenside. Pushing the pawn further claims more territory on the queenside, aiming to restrict black's rook activity and potentially prepare for a pawn breakthrough, or to create a protected passed pawn later in the endgame.